Hey, folks, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio. Thanks to all of you for joining me for all this Beatle talk that I have here on my channel. And I have a blast, as I always do, with all my guests. And I always encourage all of you, if you can, to write to me directly through my email address. If you have any ideas of things you want me to cover here on this channel, it's endless what you can talk about with the Beatles, especially if you include all their solo catalog and their solo history, along with the glory days of the Beatles' years as a group. So if you'd like to write to me, please do so at everylittlething@att.net. And here on this show, we interview lots of people in the Beatle world, people who have had relationships with them, work with them, authors, podcasters. My special guest this time is Jordan Runtagh. Jordan is a music journalist. He's written articles for People magazine, for Rolling Stone, for Entertainment Weekly. And not only that, he's also a fellow podcaster, and he has hosted or co-hosted several shows, including Inside the Studio and Off the Record, and one that sadly is not in production now, but was certainly fantastic, the shows that I've heard, called Rivals for iHeartMedia. And he is a fellow Beatle geek, and he's wanted to talk about his favorite Beatle album here on this show and the Beatle that he's most fascinated with. So we welcome Jordan to the show. How's it going?
Thank you so much for having me. I mean, I'm about to talk about my favorite Beatles album and my favorite Beatle. I mean, it's going great. This is my Super Bowl. I'm thrilled. Thank you so much for having me.
Sure. The album that you wanted to talk about was Revolver. And this is an album that certainly, at least for me, because of the fact that I grew up, I'm an old timer here, Jordan, um, a bit older than you, I would imagine. And I grew up on the American albums. And I got very used to the American albums here, which had less songs, weren't the same song lineup, similar to the British ones. And once the Beatles albums came out on CD in 1987, I never went back to the American albums, but I noticed the differences in all of them. And some of the sequencing was very much the same, but there were a lot of differences, aside from the fact that American albums had less songs. They stuck singles on the American albums, and sometimes certain albums like Yesterday and Today was a hodgepodge of songs from other Beatle albums. But Revolver was very different in the sense that the American album only had 11 tracks and the British one had 14, and it was missing 3 John Lennon songs. And once I got used to the British album, it made a world of difference. It was a much more balanced album. And I also got to hear Revolver compared to the British Rubber Soul, and what a contrast that was. So that really opened up my eyes, you know. I don't want to say that listening to the Beatles on the American albums was a mistake, but once you hear the way the Beatles released it as they intended it, certainly when you're dealing with the progression of album to album, you notice it so much more, at least I do, when you're going with the British albums. But I want to know if you listened at all to the American version. Did it start for you with the British? And are you aware of the stark contrast, at least in my opinion, between Rubber Soul and Revolver?
You know, it's funny. I actually started with the American versions also because I
Oh,
was
okay.
a kid with. It's funny. My father never stopped listening to new music, so I grew up with him playing Nirvana and Alanis Morissette and stuff in the early 90s, contemporary music in the early 90s. He never listened to the stuff from his youth. So I had discovered the Beatles just by digging through his old records and throwing them on the turntable. So
Uh,
I didn't come to CDs until I was well into my teens. So I grew up with all the American versions. So I still
uh,
find it jarring when I hear I'm Only Sleeping or Dr. Robert on there, just because it's so, I mean, those,
right.
you would know it's like when you wear those records out, they become part of your DNA. And so whenever I hear a new John song in there, it kind of throws me. And it's funny. I appreciate that the British versions are the definitive versions, the way, you know, as the Beatles intended, and, or George Martin, depending on your point of view on that. But on a certain level, at least for Rubber Soul, I almost prefer the American version. And this might be because I'm a massive Brian Wilson fan, and the way that he obsessively listened to the American Rubber Soul and really thought that it had a cohesion almost as like a folk rock album, because
Mhm.
the American version is more acoustic based. And I mean, the American version doesn't have stuff like Drive My Car on it, things that really are more funky, rocky.
Hmm.
And again, it's personal preference, just what I was used to and what I grew up listening to, and also thinking about, you know, my guy Brian Wilson, how much it sounded of a piece to him and inspired him to make Pet Sounds. I see I see the pros and cons of both,
Hmm.
but Revolver, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, John lost 3 songs on that. It becomes it's such the American version, such a Paul heavy record, and Paul is my favorite, the Beatle that I'm most fascinated by, I should say. Maybe I won't say my favorite Beatle because I'm not 13 years old in 1964, but the Beatle that I am the most fascinated by is Sir Paul. And a Revolver, I just think, perhaps more than any other album for me, I just feel like every song is a totally different world. I mean, I know you could probably make that argument for Sgt. Pepper too, but I just feel like for Revolver, they had the daring and, you know, the experimental edge, but I feel like there was a little more discipline there and it was a little more honed. And I don't know if that was because of, you know, the era when they were about to go back out on tour and they only has, you know, so many 2 months, I think, or something like that, to actually do it. Whereas with Sgt. Pepper, it could be this multi-month odyssey from, you know, late November of 66 to early April 67. Revolver just feels tighter to me, more honed. And God, I mean, the fact that the sessions began with Tomorrow Never Knows, I just think that says all you need to know. I mean, before that, I think the last song that they recorded in the studio was You Won't See Me, which would have been what, 3-4 months earlier. And to go from You Won't See Me to Tomorrow Never Knows, I just think I I feel like that's the biggest creative jump if you're charting their musical progress that the Beatles ever made, to me. And I just think it's so fascinating that they went that far so fast.
First of all, I just want to say that here on this channel, I've already had a few people, guests on the channel, who have said that they prefer the American Rubber Soul to the British one.
Yeah.
And you know, it does have more of a folk feel, and certainly when you lead things off with "I've Just Seen a Face," that really sets the tone for the rest of the album. But it's whenever I think about Revolver and Rubber Soul and comparing them, the British albums, I keep going back to the Beatles anthology and hearing George Harrison say, I didn't really see a big difference between the two albums. Revolver is like Rubber Soul Part 2. And I'm like, what album are you listening to here? I mean, I think Revolver to Sergeant Pepper was a far smoother transition than going from Rubber Soul to Revolver.
Oh, I completely agree. Although I mean, I feel like there's a lot of moments in the anthology. I think it might have been in the special features when they're listening to Here Comes the Sun or something. And George, and all 3 of them are in the studio with George Martin, and you hear George Harrison say, which album was this on? And Paul's laughing. And it's like, here's foremost Beatles expert George Harrison here, not sure what was on what. I mean, which is, you know, obviously understandable because to him it was just, you know, another piece of work. But oh, I completely agree. I think that Revolver and Sgt. Pepper are much more have much more in common sonically than Rubber Soul and Revolver.
But you know, in terms of lyrics, how much more sophisticated their lyrics were getting, how they were all over the place in terms of different musical genres. They expanded so much during Revolver. I mean, yes, you can see the progression from Paul from Yesterday to Eleanor Rigby. You know, that makes a lot of sense. You can see progression from the use of a sitar in Norwegian Wood to Love You Too. But Love You Too is a full-blown Indian song as opposed to a folk song with a sitar part on it. So, you know, there was never anything on a Beatles album that sounded like, well, you know, if you're talking about psychedelic, yes, Tomorrow Never Knows, is different to me than say I'm only sleeping or rain. They're all psychedelic, but it's so far out what they were doing with Tomorrow Never Knows. And Yellow Submarine, a children's song like that, was so different for the Beatles. Um, you know, uh, there's so many different things they did. I think Eleanor Rigby was a step up from yesterday. George Harrison getting three compositions of his own. So much progress was made in terms of what they were doing with their lyrics, the different styles of music, the different sounds they were adding to their music. It's like night and day between that and Rubber Soul for me. And
Oh,
I love both
absolutely.
in completely different reasons. They're both wonderful albums, but it's almost like they're entering a new world with Revolver.
There's so much made about A Day in a Life, about how that was sort of the apex of the Lennon-McCartney collaboration. I mean, it's easy to make that argument because you have Paul taking over on the bridge and, a very clear welding of two pieces, plus a lot of Paul's avant-garde influences with sort of John's more, reporting style lyrics that he would, end up doing later on in the 70s in his more political period. But for me, Tomorrow Never Knows, I think, is just as strong of an illustration of their collaboration, because I mean, you've got John really trying to evoke, I mean, his lyrics are an impressionistic painting, really. I mean, I know they're borrowed from the Psychedelic Experience book by Timothy Leary, but he's trying to paint a picture with words, and then you have Paul with all of his experiences with the Brunel tape, making Brunel tape loops,
Mhm.
and all the going to seminars with Luciano Berio and listening to Stockhausen and John Cage. And, he was the one, and, he is very vocal about this in later years. He was sort of the more avant-garde one than John. And he was the one who brought the stuff that really made it out there, which were all those soundscapes and the things that made it. I mean, the thing that I was always so fascinated by about that song is that, I mean, as George Martin would always say, it could never be repeated exactly the same again. With the
Right.
way all the tape loops were going, it was a moment in time. It was, I mean, random's maybe not quite the most precise word I could use, but there's something so cool about that. It's a happening. It's an audio happening,
Right.
just like the way that, Paul would go to a John Cage lecture and bang a coin on a radiator and make music just in the room out of whatever was happening. I think that he brought that whole sensibility into Tomorrow Never Knows. And I mean, for my money, maybe aside from something like Revolution Number 9, I still think it's the most staggering piece of music that they made. I mean, when Mad Men played it, I mean, obviously the Beatles are very strict about who they license their songs to, but when Mad Men chose that song for the finale of one of the pivotal episodes, they chose that song for a reason, because it was the moment the 60s became the 60s, in quotes, as we all see it, Technicolor, vibrant, paisley, psychedelicized era. Yeah, that song, I mean, and the thing that also I find so interesting about Tomorrow Never Knows is, for Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane, it was Lennon and McCartney looking at opposite points of view of, their hometown, nostalgia. I always kind of likened it to, two people sitting in an art class where the model's in the center of the room, and you have two people painting the same thing, but in totally different styles. I feel that way about Tomorrow Never Knows and Got to Get You Into My Life. And I know this is somewhat controversial, is an extreme word, but somewhat controversial because Paul's always said that Got to Get You Into My Life is about his ode to pot.
Right.
But there have been a lot of people who have theorized that the timeline is more syncs up with when he likely experimented with LSD for the first time in December of '65 with Tara Brown, the man who blew his mind out in a car. And if you listen to some of the lyrics, another kind of mind there, taking a ride, taking a trip, it almost seems to, the words seem to describe more of a psychedelic experience than an experience with marijuana. And if you pair Got to Get You Into My Life with Tomorrow Never Knows, it's almost like Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane. It's two men talking about their experiences with, psychedelics in this you know, very mind expanding, to use a cliche drug, in the ways that are really unique to them. You have John with this kind of impressionistic, abstract, I'm going to take you there, I'm going to make you feel the experience. And then you've got Paul, similar with Penny Lane, very clean, very precise, horn driven even. I don't know. I always kind of, I thought it was interesting that they followed each other on the record too. It was just something I was thinking about when I was re-listening to the album, just preparing to speak to you. I thought it was a funny, almost like flip side of their two takes on the same indescribable experience, how they both put it into music.
That is an interesting parallel, which no one has ever presented to me before, between that and Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields.
I have no idea if there's any truth to it, but
I think I agree with you. I never really thought about it that way, but it's remarkable that so many of these songs that I grew up listening to, I never knew they had any of these drug connotations at all. To me, Got to Get You Into My Life was about a woman.
yeah. Oh, totally.
And Blackbird for me was about a bird, about to take flight. I didn't think about civil rights and the plight of Black women or anything like that. You learn about that later on. But yeah, and so much of what we heard on Revolver are songs that you never heard before from the Beatles, stylistically. So, Got to Get You To My Life, to have that brass in there in your face.
The mics jam down the bells. Yeah.
To this day, even though I don't think that, the Beatles invented the brass sound, but there are bands that later on, I think they were very influenced by a song like that, a group like Chicago, for example, who even covered Got to Get You Into My Life. But it had such an influence on later bands that use brass. And Love You Too, I think, is a fascinating piece of work, because, and I still don't know to this day, how that intro came about, because I don't know if George really composed that or if he asked the Indian musicians to just improvise something. But for it to start like that on a song and then go into the song itself was really very interesting, more interesting to me now than ever before. So to see the progress, which is part of the reason why we're fascinated by the Beatles, to go from album to album, year to year, or whatever, to write your first full-blown Indian song and to be that good,
Yeah.
it's just remarkable.
Like a year after picking up the instrument, something like that.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm blown away by that introduction, and I wish I knew more about it. I personally think he probably just asked the Indian musicians to come up with something, but it certainly worked on that song. And then to have, all the psychedelic stuff that John was doing, She Said is an amazing piece of work to me. The drumming on that song, oh my God. It just, if you hear the isolation, an isolated drum part of She Said, Ringo's drums are fantastic on there.
This is my favorite era of, this is a weird thing to have a favorite of, but my favorite era of the Beatles rhythm section. I mean, She Said, Paperback Writer, Rain. It's just, I mean, you got Paul's new Rickenbacker and Ringo. I don't know how they were treating his drums, but I mean, they're like John Bonham. They're huge. It's just, yeah. Oh, I completely agree. I mean, Ringo's playing on that track is unbelievable. I mean, that song, I mean, I think that was the only song that was completed in a single day for Revolver. I think that was that not? I think that was one of the last songs, or the last song for the record.
I think it was, but I don't know if it was done in one day. I'd have to check. Yeah,
I mean, it's just, yeah, that's such an amazing song. I mean, especially because of John, I think, basically finished it on the fly, and he would later say, "Oh yeah, that bridge in the middle with When I Was a Boy, that was a real Wells." But yeah, I mean, what a heavy, I mean, it beats Steppenwolf, Born to Be Wild, by like 2 years with that heavy guitar. I love that song.
I don't know how you pick when you're talking about, the backing tracks and how well the Beatles played together, because, some friends of mine will point to the Abbey Road album, and just Paul's bass playing is off the charts on Abbey Road. And, Paul was always so locked in with Ringo.
Yeah.
So how do you pick? And what do you have to say about the growth of George Harrison as a songwriter with 3 really great songs on the album.
Oh, yeah, they gave him side one, track one. I mean, I feel like that says it all. I mean,
Yeah.
I love how that the Beatles, to my, I think my recollection is the first overtly political song was George Harrison grousing about
Hmm.
money. I enjoy that. But I mean, that's such a great track. I mean, I mean, there was all these stories about how the Beatles were considering there were plans to maybe record at Stax Studios in Memphis,
Hmm.
which would have certainly been interesting. I think it would have been a totally different album if they'd gone there and had Steve Cropper be the producer, which is something that I heard rumors of, and Tom Dowd be engineer. Would have been the only songs that I think would have been really interesting if they had been done at Stax are Taxman, because it's got that funk to it, and Gotta Get Into My Life would have been interesting too. But yeah, Taxman, what a rhythm track on that. I mean, that's like, James Brown would have been proud of that guitar rip. It's
Uh-huh.
so good.
You don't hear any kind of what someone like Steve Cropper could do with, maybe turning I Want to Tell You into something funkier.
Yeah.
I could hear that. Or maybe And Your Bird Can Sing. But that's an amazing song too. They're all amazing. But whenever I think about And Your Bird Can Sing with the dual guitar parts and packing so much into 2 minutes and the great bass line on that song, so much, then great harmonies. It's 2 minutes of Nirvana.
Oh, I mean, the thing about And Your Bird Can Sing, I mean, that just always stuns me is that I learned to play guitar purely to be able to dissect Beatles songs and just figure out, if I could take this apart and do it myself, maybe I'll figure out how the magic is made, which of course is not true at all.
Hmm.
But, as a teenager and to this day, I'm going to be 34 in a month, playing for 20 something years. I still can't play And Your Bird Can Sing. I don't know how they do that. Those guitar harmonies. I was in a band and we did a lot of Thin Lizzy type, guitars in sync. The way that those guitars lock in is unreal. That is such a great track. I mean, I feel like they, were taking a page from the Byrds and really just taking it to the nth degree. I mean, yeah, it's such an incredible track.
Well, for a long time, I put off going to see Beatles cover bands because my thought was, how can you top the originals? But then these days, I have a completely different change of heart because, well, for one thing, I really like when people do their own arrangements of Beatles songs. But when they try to copy the Beatles and they never quite get it right, it makes you realize how much work was put into those Beatles songs,
Yeah.
whether it's vocals, harmonies, guitar parts, the bass line, what Ringo was playing. It's very hard to duplicate that.
Here's a question for you. Do you have any idea what And Your Bird Can Sing is about?
No, I've heard some convoluted explanation about it, but I can't recall what it was. No.
Heard something about him allegedly addressing Mick Jagger, and talking about Marianne Faithfull being the, bird being slang for
Yeah.
woman in mid-60s England. But yeah, I don't even think the timeline works on that, because I don't even think Mick was dating Marianne Faithfull at the time. But yeah, it's I was thinking, listening to Revolver, yesterday and today, pun not intended. And yeah, I was still trying to figure out what he could be talking about. I'm still no closer to knowing.
Yeah. Certainly with Yesterday and then later on, all those classical influences played such a big part in some of the songs that I cherish from the Beatles. And even though Yesterday and Eleanor Rigby get a lot of attention, and I think She's Leaving Home deserves a ton of attention, I think there's been a growing appreciation through the decades for No One. And I
Mm.
really think that's a brilliant piece of work.
I think, and I need to think more about this. I feel like that is maybe the most devastating Beatles song that you don't need to know any kind of context. I mean, Julia still hits me because I know who Julia is in the context of the Beatles and I know the story behind it. But this, purely as a piece of, as a piece of fiction, it's affecting. I mean, the fact that Paul's using second person, I think, is really an interesting choice. Although I guess they did that on "She Loves You" too. I always saw "For No One" as sort of the flip side of "And I Love Her." Paul wrote for Jane Asher, and because the working title for "No One" was "Why Did It Die?" And in "And I Love Her," a love like ours will never die. Why did it die? I was written, I think it was written in early '66 when he and Jane were on vacation together in Switzerland. And they were already starting to have problems at this time. I mean, you have songs like, "I'm Looking Through You," "We Can Work It Out," things we said today even suggests that things weren't all well in their relationship.
And
that
"You Won't See Me."
Right. Yeah, "You Won't See Me." I mean, that song, I mean, I have always loved his, I mean, he did this Eleanor Rigby. I know John kind of gave him grief for it in interviews, might have even been the famous Rolling Stone interview, about Paul kind of approaching songwriting like a novelist. And I think he meant it as an insult, because it's not real, man. It's not it's not feeling. It's all, I feel the opposite. I think it's so, I admire his ability to create affecting works of fiction lyrically, in addition to these beautiful melodies. I mean, the fact that you can do both and put them together, I think is one of the things that makes him, the Beatle that I'm the most fascinated by. But I also think it's interesting that there probably is a lot more of himself in these, quote, fictional lyrics than he lets on. I think that's something very him. I think he's a very, there's a, lot's been said about his sort of, thumbs up smiley guy persona. And there's a much more steely guy beneath the surface. And I think that a lot of these kind of fictional songs, For No One being a great example, I think probably has more of himself in there than he wants to let on. And maybe the fact that he's projecting it onto a third party makes it easier for him to deal with. Like, they say that every character in your dream is really you. Like every character in Paul's songs is really him. But what a gorgeous song. I mean, I feel like I say that for every song we've been talking about, but it really just the Baroque instrumentation, Alan Civil's incredible solo, which apparently has a note that doesn't exist in it,
and he managed to do it.
Which makes it even more magical.
Yeah,
and just even his use of language, just rhythmically. I mean, having the verses start off with the two short lines, your day breaks, your mind aches. She wakes up, she makes up, she takes her time. The fact that he follows the two short lines with a really long one that kind of unspirals. It just rhythmically is such an interesting song. It drives it forward. Yeah, I just think that in this case, lyrically, what he does lyrically is just as fascinating, if not more so, than what he does with the instrumentation, which is also extremely groundbreaking. I mean, I think this would probably predate God Only Knows, which I think is one of the first harpsichord top 10 songs that I can think of. So it's just interesting, just instrumentation wise too.
Yeah. And I, for one, I've come to really appreciate, as someone who has always loved like TV themes and commercials and how you can get a message across in 30 seconds or whatever. When you can write a great song that's only 2 minutes long and you say so much in it, you pack so much lyrically, it tells a whole story in just 2 minutes. I think that is miraculous in its own way. So that's one of the reasons why I love that song and so many other Beatles songs. But yeah, I like what you said about rhythmically, the way that he words it. It's almost like your day breaks, your mind aches. It's like you're having a headache. Like this is a strain. This is a strain on you. It's interesting.
I mean, your day breaks, your mind aches. It just it just feels like a sigh. It feels like trying to rouse yourself out of this depression, and it's just not happening. And it just comes across just in the rhythm of the words itself, not even the melody. Yeah, it's fascinating.
So tell me, I've noticed, in the last several decades, a growing appreciation for Revolver. I would like to see all the pre Sgt. Pepper albums from the Beatles on the charts on a regular basis, but you never see any of those. You will if there's an archival box set, but it's always Sgt. Pepper, White Album, Abbey Road. Those are the ones that always reappear on the charts. I know Let It Be is on there now, but that's mainly because of the box set. But as far as this, I'm not going to say new appreciation because I believe it's been going on. It could be even past when the CDs came out in 1987. Why do you suppose that is? Especially after so many years of being told Sgt. Pepper is the greatest album from the Beatles. What in your, how would you explain this growing appreciation over the years for Revolver?
I almost wonder if this is going to sound elitist, and I don't mean it to. I almost wonder if it's similar to the growing appreciation for something like Pet Sounds, where enough people that were really into music, fellow musicians, which I mean, were effusive enough in their praise for this being the record that really was a breakthrough and really inspiring and really opened the door in so many ways, that enough people started to listen to that, maybe. Because I do think that, aside from maybe the whole concept album sense of Sgt. Pepper, which, is John even said, and everyone knows, doesn't really hold water aside from having it be bookended. I think that sonically and just all the studio techniques that were really groundbreaking took place on Revolver. I think that Revolver is just a much more innovative and revolutionary record. I always thought it was interesting that they called it Revolver because it almost sounds like Evolver. Something that, I don't know. It just always, that's my guess. I know that these things kind of are cyclical too. I mean, if the same albums are praised long enough, you start getting people that think they're overrated and, start looking elsewhere. So it might just be fatigue too. It just might have been 20 something years of people saying Sgt. Pepper was the greatest album of all time, and then kind of being sick of it, which might have happened to me. I mean, I kind of I was a teenager in the early 2000s when I think Rolling Stone first named it the greatest album of all time. And it might have predisposed me against it. It might have made me think, okay, well, I keep hearing this again and again from VH1 might have also named it the number one. It just was something you heard again and again. And maybe it's just something that you just got sick of. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know which came first. That for me personally, I don't know when it became my favorite in the context of seeing all these lists coming out. But that could be it too. It might just be after so long of it being hailed as the greatest, you started having people thinking more critically about it.
Yeah. I've also heard from a lot of Beatle fans who, while they appreciate Sgt. Pepper, they'll say, but it's not the Beatles album I listen to the most.
No, yeah.
And I have my own theory that I think through the years, especially in the 90s, when you had a lot of the hard rock bands come out from Seattle, and like Unplugged became such a big thing on MTV and VH1, people got to hear more stripped down, just bands as they were, not overproduced. Not that Sgt. Pepper is overproduced, but I mean, not multi-layered types of recordings. I think there's been more popularity towards that kind of music production wise since that time. Maybe, do you agree with me?
Yeah, oh, I do. And I don't, you might violently disagree with this. There's something about Sgt. Pepper to me, I'm going to regret saying this as soon as I do, that feels almost dated. And I don't mean dated like their Satanic Majesty's Request or anything like that. It's not, but there's something of, it's so linked to a time and an era, and just the whole, I mean, just even the cover, the whole psychedelic flowery explosion. Whereas Revolver, to me, and maybe this is just a personal bias, seems to just exist in its own world. It seems to have aged better. I don't think there's anything that really dates any of the particular songs. Whereas with a lot of the stuff on Sergeant Pepper, some of the effects, I mean, being for the benefit of Mr. Kite with all the swirly kind of like, you know,
Hmm.
Carnival from Hell stuff, and and A Day in a Life is one of the songs that they play in 60s montages of swinging London, whatever. It's something about it, and again, this might just be me having watched too many History Channel documentaries or whatever, where certain songs have become so locked in with certain images. Revolver, I feel is free of any kind of extraneous uh, visions to me. I mean, even the cover kind of, to me, it doesn't register to me as psychedelic. It registers as a strange kind of adventure. I mean, some of the early working titles like Abracadabra and the Magic Circle
Hmm.
almost feel appropriate to me, because it does feel like it's nothing other than just unique. I don't think that there's anything that feels like it's of a certain era. I mean, granted, they defined the era with Sergeant Pepper, so I'm no way like saying that I think that they were trend hopping or anything. But to me, I think Revolver feels more distinct of a piece than Sergeant Pepper. But that could just be me.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I don't know how much you've watched any of the podcast shows that I've done, but I could be in a minority here in the sense that I could care less whether or not music sounds dated to me, because
Mm.
it's not going to stop me from loving Sergeant Pepper. I know a lot of people have said to me the early Beatles music sounds dated. Well, it's not going to stop me from loving that
Right.
music as well. There's so much music, from big band music of the 40s to music from the 50s rock and roll that is from the 50s, and I still love it. I'm not really affected by whether or not it sounds contemporary. But I will admit that if I had to pick a Beatles album to listen to these days, all the way through. And most of the time, I listen to a compilation. I listen to a mixture of Beatles and solo all the time, kind of like my radio show. But I'd much rather listen to Revolver today than Sergeant Pepper. But that might just be more from fatigue, because Sergeant
Mm.
Pepper has been played to death, on the radio, and and it deserves to have been played to
Yeah.
death. And whereas Revolver didn't get as much acclaim as I think it deserves. And now people are realizing what a jump that was for the Beatles, um, in particular. Like I said, going from Rubber Soul to that. But that's just how I feel. I'm not affected by, whether or not certain albums or songs sound dated at all. Are you?
No, I mean, I think that I almost feel I can't explain why this is, but I just to sort of echo what you just said. Revolver, I haven't gotten sick of. Whereas there are sometimes I just don't feel like listening to Sergeant Pepper. It just feels like I can't explain. That's the only way I know how to articulate it. Is that it's I guess that's what your definition of your favorite album is, something that you will never get sick of. You will just
Mm,
play it endlessly. And I think that's, it's kind of a riddle, because it just, the definition of your favorite album is just one that you'll just play all the time and never gets old to you.
right.
And yeah, I don't know if Sergeant Pepper just was something that was just shoved down my throat so much when I was first getting into the Beatles as the one that you need to pay attention to, and now I'm kind of checking out this one that was a little off to the side, or what. But in terms of things sounding dated, no, I mean, in a lot of ways, I kind of is why I like a lot of music,
Mm,
because it takes me to a place that I dream of, or wish I was, or I'm fascinated by, or I'm inspired by. And sometimes, I mean, that would be why I listen to certain songs, because they are so associated with a certain time, place, person, whatever it is.
right. So Revolver is your favorite Beatle album. Is it your favorite album, period, from any artist?
I would have to say so. Pet Sounds is close, but I think that, and I think my favorite song, if you really forced me to pick one is probably Got to Get Into My Life. I just think, I mean, I just think it's the most joyous, exuberant, exciting, all the way down to just how, I mean, that on the fade out, when that trumpet hits that wild note that's just screaming up, that's the best. I mean, that to me, that is, if I had to pick 1 second in music, that would just be joy, exhilaration, hope. It's that. It's right at the fade out. I always have to really crank up my headphones to hear it in all its glory. But when that trumpet screams at the very end, like when there's 5 seconds to go, it is just the best. I mean, and just the way that song's structured too. I mean, the tension between the bass that doesn't move in all the verses, just repeatedly, and then the chord, the jazzy chord. I think it's a major 7th chord, which is something that something like another song I really love is Joe Jackson, Stepping Out. And he does something similar too. Just there's something it's like a night on the town. You're going out, you're taking a ride. You don't know what the night's going to bring. That is what that sound just sonically evokes for me. I mean, even without the lyrics or anything. I mean, I just think that musically it's so constructed to be exciting. And then of course you have the horn track where, Jeff Remick was shoving the mics down the bells of the Blue Flames horn section and stuff, and it's just screaming. I think that is Revolver's my favorite album of all time, and I think Got to Get Into My Life is probably my favorite song of all time.
Right. All right. Now, didn't you tell me 1966 is your favorite year period in music?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, God, come on. I mean,
hey, you can make a case for every year.
Right, that's true. That's true. I mean, God, I mean, Blonde on Blonde, Pet Sounds, Revolver, Parsley, Sage, Rosemary and Thyme, the first Cream album. I mean, so many great Donovan stuff, so many great Kink stuff. It just, I mean, to me, that is it. To me, this is going to make me sound like a curmudgeon, and I don't mean it to. I feel like that was the era when there was enough of an emphasis put on, this is a gross generalization, songcraft, because you're not that far removed from the Tin Pan Alley where you get people like, the people who wrote How Do You Do It, Mitch Murray, and people like that who, you're competing against those types of songwriters. So you have to make it good enough melodically to be able to stand alongside that in the charts. But you are getting experimental. Love and Spoonful, man, I love Love and Spoonful, and you can hear the influence on something like, Good Day Sunshine. I just think that's for me, that's the sweet spot as somebody who really likes. Yeah, I mean, McCartney is my favorite Beatle because those melodies are really what attract me. I know there's a lot of people I know that love the music John made because it was more, to them, emotionally affecting. You listen to all their guitar solos in the end, Paul's got the most melodic to me. John's is just him kind of hitting the guitar. People love that. And I can see why. Proto-punk, it's all feeling, it's all emotion. It's so much of him expressing. But to me, I love the melody. I love what Paul's able to do. And I think 1966 as a year really has just such a wealth of those types of songs that have experimentation, have the avant-garde, Good Vibrations being, such an incredible studio production. It's like an audio movie being cut together with little scenes. I think it's such a fascinating blend of both. I think that's why I love Revolver, and that's why I love 1966 as a year. To me, overall, that's me way over intellectualizing just the fact that I love the songs from that year. I mean, that's me trying to justify, why I love, Blonde on Blonde or Parsley, Sage, Rosemary and Thyme.
Well, as someone who's had a career in radio and classic rock, which has been such a successful format for so long, even though they don't really play that much 60s music apart from maybe a weekend Beatles show, if you're ever going to hear anything on classic rock radio these days from the 60s, it's always from 1967 on up.
Yeah.
Because 1967 is like that dividing line right there when it seemed like it was the birth of the album as an art form, whether it was Sergeant Pepper or the Doors' first album or Jefferson Airplane or Jimi Hendrix. That seemed to be the year that had the biggest impact, where rock and roll was really developing, and all of a sudden things became so centered around the album.
And
You still had hit
serious.
singles. Yeah. So how do you debate between 66 and 67? Because it was so much growth, so much progression happening so quickly. You know, there's a guy I know that wrote a book a few years ago why 1965 was the greatest year in music. Everybody can
Oh, that's
make
a
a
great
case
book.
in point for every single year if they want to. You ask my wife, 1964, nothing will ever top it. She's a big Beatle freak. The whole British invasion coming over here, not all of them, but most of them. But if you compare 66 to 67, I still want to understand if we've been programmed to think, so much started in 67. It was a whole new universe when 67 hit and we had all these new albums coming out.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that 67 was, the birth of classic rock. In terms of the radio format that's there now. I feel like you don't get too much before that would really fit in alongside the Led Zeppelins and the Jimi Hendrixes and stuff
Hmm.
that is just sonically louder. um I I mean, so much of it is personal preference, but I think I just appreciated I liked and still like the a combination of the studio as an instrument. I love all the Phil Spector stuff. I know I'm in the minority here. I mean, as much as I love the Ronettes and everything, I love River Deep Mountain High. I think that
I love
is
it.
I think that's his crowning song, more than Be My Baby, which is also an amazing song, obviously. And that was 66, River Deep Mountain High. All the stuff that Brian Wilson was doing, all the stuff that Ray Davies was doing. I I like the mix of the technical mastery of the studio, which I think really came into its own, I think, in 66. And I appreciate, I like all the Baroque pop stuff.
Hmm.
I mean, this was a couple years later, but Odyssey and Oracle is one of my favorite albums by the
Me too.
Zombies.
Me
I mean,
too.
just, oh my God, that's just a mind blowing record.
You like a
Um,
lot of the classically influenced stuff.
yeah, I can't say, I don't necessarily argue that it's better than Foxy Lady or some
Hmm.
really insane Jimmy Page era Yardbird solo or anything. But to me, I mean, that's just the stuff that I like. I like the kind of stuff that Paul was getting into around that time in the mid 60s when he was hanging out with Peter Asher and Barry Miles and John Dunbar at Indica, listening to Ornette
Hmm.
Coleman and hanging out with William Burroughs, which I still find really surreal. Um, and all those kind of more classical influences. I like tracing the line from, I think this was an Elvis Costello line that I'm stealing from some documentary, from George Gershwin, Cole Porter, Burt Bacharach, Brian Wilson, Lennon, McCartney, that kind of songwriter continuum through the 20th century that links
Hmm.
it back to something like Rhapsody in Blue. Rhapsody in Blue is one of my favorite pieces of music ever. I mean, and again, how much of that
Yeah.
is a personal preference? Totally a personal preference. I mean, I know, I'm not a metalhead, but I've had very dear friends of mine that have sat me down and talked at length about why uh, heavy metal is basically electrified classical music. I don't, it doesn't hit me that same way, but I respect it. And I'm endlessly fascinated by people
Hmm.
who can articulate that and explain it to me. I'm not able to do it right now, but yeah. So 66 versus 67. I, to me, again, this is going to make me sound like a fuddy-duddy curmudgeon in a tweed jacket. This isn't tweed, with patches on the shoulder and the elbows. But it felt like there was a discipline that started to go. I mean, to use the Beatles as an example, and this is not a judgment call, I feel like with Revolver, the sessions were still relatively orderly. The time frame that they needed to record between tours kept things, there was a great economy of what they did in the studio. And from Sgt. Pepper onward, White Album probably being the most egregious example of this, when the sessions would just sprawl on to be these 12, 14, 16-hour affairs that went all night.
Uh-huh.
I sense, and I can't articulate why, that there was something lost in that. There's a focus that I feel like is present on something like Rubber Soul and Revolver that isn't there on something like the White Album. I feel like I stepped on a landmine.
The White Album's my favorite Beatle album.
I mean,
I just love the fact that musically they're all over the place, and I'm someone that loves variety, and I admire artists that can go everywhere. I've said a million times, the fact that on the same album you've got Helter Skelter and Honey Pie and Revolution Number 9 in the same breath, is mind-boggling. There's no other band that could do what the Beatles did on the White Album. So many different styles.
Revolver.
Yeah.
I mean, Good Day Sunshine to Tomorrow Never Knows to Taxman even. I think that it's same. I think at this point it's, pick your dealer's choice in terms of what is your favorite illustration of the Beatles scope. Just Revolver's mine, just for reasons that may or may not be real, but to me it feels more restrained, feels more disciplined. I don't know why that should matter, and I know in the grand scheme of things it doesn't, but it's just something that really is fascinating. I mean, getting back to what we were saying earlier about potentially recording the album at Stax, I think it would have been a totally different album because Stax was so much, studios in America were so much looser and hipper, and the session player, it just, Abbey Road was an institution. You had the guys in lab coats. I think that it gave the Beatles something to kind of rebel against, and I think that you kind of need to have that kind of almost a sparring partner in a sense with these people that when they were recording when Jeff Emmerich was recording the string section for Eleanor Rigby, Paul really wanted to be able to hear the horsehair on the string of the bow. They really wanted it close mic'd, and the players were like, you can't do that, and they would move their chairs back, and George Martin had to come over the talk back and say, no, please get closer, it's okay. And there, just thinking about, I know it's a silly example, but just how rigid it was at Abbey Road, I think was kind of interesting, because it gave him something to push up against, gave him a framework to kind of work in, to kind of subvert. And I think that's what I love about my favorite Beatles stuff. That's what I love about Paul too, is that I think in a lot of ways he was the most subversive, and it was the most shocking because he does appear to be the cute one, the Mr. Thumbs Aloft, kind of guy. And then he would want to do, the album that I always wished he made was that one in the mid 60s where he wanted to make like a Frank Zappa album. Then he said Paul McCartney Goes Too Far was the album he wanted it to be, and he wanted to do he was really inspired by the first Mothers of Invention album, Freak Out. And I love that side of him. I know we're getting more into, I'm fascinated with Paul. When the mixtape he made for the Beatles for the Christmas of '65, put together a mix, and it's on YouTube now. And if anyone hasn't heard it, it's so cool to check out. He makes a little radio show, and he plays a little American announcer, and it's just so cool to see the scope of his musical influences. And he makes it for the other Beatles to basically say, these are some things you should check out that I don't think you've heard. I know that he's accused so much of being kind of the bossy one, who is just overstepping boundaries and trying to tell George what to play, and taking over for Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour and the Get Back sessions, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think that, in the mid 60s, he was the one in London going to art gallery openings, and it was plugged into all the things that were happening and new. And I know in years later, he really resented the fact that John had the reputation largely because of Yoko, secondhand through Yoko, as being the kind of avant-garde out there one. Whereas Paul, I really think, was the primary motivator that moved the Beatles. I think that the jump from Revolver, or from Rubber Soul to Revolver, is really Paul, I think. And what do you think? I mean, is that
That's a pretty bold statement. I think, you got to give John a lot of credit too for writing and wanting something so bizarre as Tomorrow Never Knows. Yes, the tape loops make a big difference. There's no doubt about it. And a lot of the production changes, what Jeff Emmerich was doing, all that close miking. I had the privilege of interviewing him one time,
wow.
Jeff Emmerich, and even with something like Love You Too, he close mic'd the Indian instruments. So I'm sure he did the same thing with the horns, with Got to Get You to My Life and all. So that made a difference in the sound. And, I understand what you're saying, especially because Ringo has said this quite often, that, in the last few years, the phone would ring and they'd always know it was Paul, come on, let's record something. He was driving them. And we don't know if they ever would have continued, if they would have been as productive if it wasn't for him. He was always pushing the band in that regard. But yeah, he's so creative at that time. He's still so creative to this day. But I don't know if I would give Paul all the credit, when it comes to Revolver, because a lot of the stuff, everything they were doing was so innovative. All of them, in terms of the songwriting, in terms of what they were playing on their records, but definitely Paul deserves a ton of credit. And there are some people I know who seem to think that Revolver, if you just take the songs that Paul wrote, they could be like the best songs of his career. Just on that, Eleanor Rigby, For No One, Here, There, and Everywhere, which we haven't even talked about, which he cites as being, his favorite song. A very complete song. Everything is perfect about it. It flows so well. And Got to Get You to My Life. Am I forgetting any? But those are just so way high up on top of the chain for Paul songs, and they were all on one album. So yeah, I give him a ton of credit, but I can't give him all the credit. Give him a lot.
No, I mean, I'm hyperbolic, and I know I'm, because I'm a Paul guy, I'm probably coming a little too hard for him. I do enjoy.
Oh, Good Day Sunshine. I forgot. Good Day Sunshine.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
I do enjoy John's. I think that Paul was a really effective translator for John in a lot of cases about what he wanted musically, because John so famously didn't really know how to express himself in musical terms. I mean, Tomorrow Never Knows being the great example of, him wanting to sound like the Dalai Lama on a hilltop. So, why don't you string me down from the ceiling of Studio 2 and push me in a circle like a big tether ball and put a microphone in the center. And no, we can, don't worry, we'll figure something else out, Sean. We won't just string you down from the ceiling. And there's that story, probably apocryphal, about did he say that George Martin, I want this to sound orange? Was that
He
real?
said something. Yeah, I think he expressed himself with colors. I know with being for the benefit of Mr. Kite, he said he wants to smell the sawdust off the floor. And George Martin had to figure out what exactly he wanted. He wasn't able to express himself and know exactly what he wanted as well as Paul knew. Yeah.
I was always interested in how he expressed himself through pictures and sensory things, as opposed to Paul sitting down at the piano and humming what he wanted. I always admired John's unorthodox.
Give me a green sound, I think he said. Yeah. But this is great conversation right here. But there's, when you talk about the White Album, I like how free form it was. Some people look at that as being overindulgent. I like it, whereas Revolver is more disciplined. So you can look at it that way.
Oh yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I know that it's purely, the fact that people love and feel so strongly about all these albums makes me feel great. I mean, I just think it's the best thing in the world that people can be, these albums all make people so happy. And I think that, but while discussing and having fun debates about all of this, I want to focus on that too. First and foremost is that, my least favorite Beatles album is somebody's favorite Beatles album, and it gives them untold joy. And, for that, I say, God bless them. I mean, that's why we're here. I mean, that's why this show exists. That's why we are, so much of what makes us who we are is because we love this.
Yeah, Beatle fans are very passionate about the music. And if you were to say, like, usually at the bottom of the list when it comes to Beatles albums would be Beatles for Sale or Let It Be. And if you say that, you're going to have people saying, how dare you say that?
Right.
That's my favorite. I don't really count Yellow Submarine as an album, or that kind of thing. But yeah, but you're going to get that no matter what. But going back to Paul, why he's your favorite. Let's take a look at his entire catalog, all of his solo music too. Why would you say he's your favorite when you take a look at all four of them? And there's so much music there to appreciate from all four, group and solo.
I think it's probably in a lot of ways the same reason you like the White Album. I think it's volume and variety. My favorite album of his, and I know it's become kind of the thing to say now, is Ram. I just think that's such a strange. I love when he gets strange. I love that he's not afraid to get strange. I love the fact that he made Thrillington. I listen to Thrillington probably more than I listen to Band on the Run these days, which says more about me than it does about him. But I love the album that he made, Electric Arguments with the producer Youth in 2008. That's actually one of my favorite albums he's done. I love when music just seems such a cliche when talking about Paul McCartney, but it really does seem to just pour out of him. I mean, he can pick up any instrument and just seemingly play it just instantly. I mean, he can make any instrument do whatever he wants it to do. I mean, he's a total music maker. And I love listening to albums that are so clearly him having fun and feeling the joy. When the joy of creation is coming through in his records, that's when I get the most excited. I feel like you feel that in all three of the McCartneys, just because they're so purely, it's him and home. I feel like you sense that with Ram kind of maybe being a little more inspired after, McCartney 1 didn't really set the world. I don't think he was trying to set the world on fire, but John kind of slagging it off in the press. Maybe he was kind of reinvigorated to try to make a good one again. And I mean, Backseat of My Car, that song is high on my list of favorite songs of all time. I think that is melodically, the harmonies, the string section and the bridge. I just think that is, I think it's up there with Sgt. Pepper. I know I'm people are going to think I'm absolutely nuts, but I just think that is such a gorgeous song. And then I also appreciate, it's not the stuff I would listen to all the time, but when he's clearly going for a number one. I mean, you get your Band on the Runs and your Speed of Sounds and Tug of War. All great records, but for me, I like the ones when he's kind of on a farm and maybe lighting up one too many spliffs. Red Rose Speedway. Red Rose Speedway, I think is amazing. Even that medley at the end, which
it's brilliant,
is brilliant in its simplicity. It's just I like how it's not a lot of pyrotechnics. It's just a lot of really incredible melodies with kind of childish lyrics that don't really mean anything, and he's got so many melodies, he's just going to cram them all on one track because he can, because he's got them and they're there. Red Rose Speedway, Ram. I even like Wildlife, which I think not a lot of people are really all that into. I mean, Some People Never Know, I think, is a supremely underrated McCartney song. It's a great version by they're either Peruvian or Brazilian band in the early 70s called We All Together. And it might be on the Nuggets box set compilation. If any of you haven't heard it, it's a really sweet cover of that song, which is a really sweet, beautiful song. Yeah, I like when he's left of center. I like when he and Linda are being weird, and the image I always have is of them with their face painted and just kind of like making silly faces into the camera. I like that. I like that he is so gifted and so talented and has such a incredible backlog of legendary music already by age 29, and he's able to not take himself or it too seriously. That to me is what is so exciting about him. And as I said earlier, I mean, the word subversive comes to mind. I know he was a big fan of the Belgian surrealist painter Rene Magritte, and I think they're very similar. I mean, Magritte was this very straight-laced looking pinstripe suit wearing guy who would make these really freaky, almost realistic, but then one thing that's totally off that completely throws it. And I think that that's something Paul does a lot in his music too. I mean, even in something like Another Day, or Eleanor Rigby, Face in a Jar by the Door. It's all very prose, novelistic prose, but then you get these funny turns of phrase that to me are like a lyrical Magritte painting. I mean, Face in a Jar by the Door is almost like that painting where you have the guy with the apple in front of his face, or the clouds. To me, it's something that you almost recognize it, but then when you look closer at it, it doesn't. It's poetry. It's sheer poetry, but it almost seems hyper realistic. That's what I love about Magritte, and that's what I love about Paul. I think that they are both guys who, on the surface, appear straighter than straight, but are actually really subversive and bizarre and weird. And I love that, maybe because I feel like I'm a little bit that way too, and maybe that's a bit of an inspiration, but I like that. I like that he's sort of able to exist in the top 40 world, but then completely go off the rails and do his own thing. I mean, McCartney too is bizarre. Back to the Egg is bizarre. I love Back to the Egg. It's one of my favorite Wings albums. And every time I say that, people look at me like I have three heads. I love Back to the Egg. I mean, I think that, from the opening radio montage with Reception, closing with Baby's Request, which is like an old Cole Porter song or an old Gershwin song. I mean, when you open with something that's an electronic sound collage and you close with something that could have been in an old, Bugsy Berkeley movie or something, that's Paul McCartney right there. I mean, that's
all the dance hall stuff that he's written fit the same, the same category. You gave me the answer.
Yeah.
Or When I'm 64, Honey Pie, that stuff.
Ballroom dancing.
Yeah. But what I'm finding really interesting now, and for years, I couldn't understand. I'm a huge fan of Press to Play.
Mm-hmm.
And also Driving Rain, I've grown to love a lot more. And those are two albums that get really ridiculed a lot these days. And when it comes to Press to Play, because of the 80s production, it gets labeled as being dated, but I also see him being experimental, and I applaud him when he tries to sound, he's learning from the new styles of the time, the new production, the instrumentation, the different sounds. I like the fact that he's not just repeating himself over and over again. And a lot of fans don't like when it seems like he's trying too hard to sound contemporary. He's trying too hard to have a hit record. And see, what I failed to understand all this time is, how can you not like Press to Play and you like McCartney 2?
That's a great
McCartney
point.
2 is extremely experimental, but it's just him futzing around in the studio doing. I think fans like when he does whatever the hell he wants and doesn't care about the success of the record, which is hard for me to picture, because I think Paul always cares about his record sales and he always wants to chart high. But they prefer something like McCartney 2, and some of the songs there, to me, are not disciplined songs. They're not fully fledged songs. to me, or even something like Check My Machine, which he even goes so far as to put into the lyrics book. That
I
it's
know.
just, it's all Check My Machine. That's all that he says
Temporary
in the whole song.
secretary.
Yeah, Temporary Secretary at least has, there's a lot of
A
work
little bit.
behind it in
Yeah.
terms of the lyrics and, um, the verses and the chorus and everything. And Nobody Knows sounds like something he just made up on the spot. Um, I like to sense some effort put into the songwriting, and yet there are people who prefer that over a press to play, where every single song he worked on really hard, as far as I'm
Yeah.
concerned. So I just think I'm starting to realize that a lot of fans really like when Paul just doesn't give a damn. He's going to do whatever he wants to do. And in the process, he still manages to put out some really catchy songs because that's what's in his DNA anyway. If you listen to something like Ram, that's the perfect example of that. You've got an Uncle Albert Admiral Halsey, which is so brilliant beyond words. You can see how it was a huge hit at the time. And Backseat of My Car, on the one hand, has this great melody, and then, it has this false ending, and he starts screaming at the end, and, it's wonderful. It is like a medley, but that song. And you've got something like Three Legs, which is this
Hmm.
quirky song, which he just feels like doing at the time.
Yeah.
A lot of it is this balance between something that you expect from him and then just going off and doing whatever he feels like in the moment. And he doesn't really care. He's going to just do whatever he feels like. And I think there are a lot of fans that prefer when he's that way, more comfortable, more relaxed. That's more who he is.
There's something I noticed, and it's a shame. I should have actually, I didn't think to say this, and I should have written it down. I've noticed that the last track on so many of McCartney's albums, to me, are my favorite because, I mean, they're usually the longest and the weirdest. I mean, you've got something like 1985, Backseat in My Car, Morse Moose and the Grey Goose,
Yeah.
Rinse the Raindrops from Driving Rain. I love Driving Rain, by the way. There
Oh,
are all
good.
these ones that kind of spiral out, and I always think that that's where he sticks. Like even the one on the Electric Arguments album. I'm trying to remember what the last track on that. Is it Keep On Running? It might
I
be
think
Keep On
that's it.
Running. Um, I've always my 9 times out of 10, my favorite track on a given McCartney album will be the last track because I feel like that's where he sticks his weird, loose, long epic.
Uh-huh.
And I don't really know how intentional that is, but I mean, maybe it's just a climax. Maybe he just knows how to sequence an album well, which
Hmm.
Lord knows he's had good practice. But I always found it interesting that he always has like these really long 6-7 minute tracks, usually as the
And
last track.
let's not forget Krina Kror.
Oh yes, I mean yes, totally.
Are
Right
you
out
a
of the gate.
fan? Are you a fan of that?
It's hard not to be. I mean,
Oh, there are people I know who hate it, who,
really?
who can't, yeah, who
I
don't
mean,
see the value in it. I love it because
I
it's so
love it.
improvisational.
Yeah. I mean, I love. I mean, honestly, the guitar sound that he gets on that album. I don't know if it's just from being plugging his Epiphone Casino right into the Studer 4 track or what. But I mean, I would kill for that guitar sound that he has. I mean,
Hmm.
it's just the word searing is overused when describing guitar solos. By the
Uh,
way, forgot to mention my favorite Beatle guitar solo I think ever, Taxman.
that's a good
Incredible,
one.
Paul's Epiphone. Shining moment there. Oh yeah. Oh, I love that track. I think I definitely see the value in it. I think it's fun. I think it's really beautiful. I I like the harmonies. I love the rhythms of it. I
Uh-huh.
like what you said earlier about it being so freeform and improvisational. I think it's great, especially coming after Maybe I'm Amazed.
Yeah, well, it's like you said, you've got the more disciplined Paul. There's always going to be that top 40 Paul.
Yeah.
Listen to what the man said, Paul. And then you've got, the experimental stuff. But sometimes one of the things that I find a little upsetting about him is that I think he's so self-conscious about his image that he thinks that he's going to make an album that he feels this is what the public expects of him. And his more experimental stuff, he sometimes uses as B-sides or bonus tracks to his CDs on CD singles and all that, or something like The Fireman.
Mm,
I mean, why couldn't you just go out and call that Paul McCartney? He wouldn't do that.
yeah.
I mean, eventually, with Electric Arguments, we figured it out, and he let the cat out of the bag. We all knew anyway. But even when he does something like that, that's very experimental, he can't call it a Paul McCartney album, even though he's got experimental tracks here and there throughout his solo career. So, a lot of the most interesting stuff that he's done are songs that weren't even on the albums.
Which is so strange because I feel like in recent years, by which I'll probably define 40 years now that I'm really thinking about it, he's been very vocal about his role in wanting to assert his weirdness
Uh-huh.
in terms of, especially in the Beatles, especially alongside John. And you even see that in some of the, the interviews that he gives, and not only the outlets that he goes to, but just some of the quotes that he gives. Kind of like, I think that he doesn't shy away from that in so many ways. It's interesting that he does musically. It's interesting that, like you just said, I mean, Electric Arguments, I think, is probably my favorite Paul album of the last, since Flaming Pie, I think. Yeah. I mean, now I have to think about it, but I mean, I just think it's great. And it's interesting that he didn't embrace that more. You're right. And put it as, the sort of, I mean, he obviously loves, he's the king of the pseudonyms between Sergeant Pepper and Percy Thrills Thrillington and
Yeah.
Susie and the Red Streaks and what
Stripes.
else?
Yeah.
Red Stripes. Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know. Maybe he just finds it part of the fun. Maybe he thinks it's just being playful, that he is the most famous musician arguably on the planet. So why not have a little fun and put this mask on and really complete the illusion? I mean, I think he, even for that new kids book he had, Hey Grand Dude, he put like funny fake advertisements or classified ads or something in papers in England. Yeah, it was like
Okay.
Grand Dude looking for Grand Mum or something. I forget. It was some funny, I mean, like he did for Thrillington when Thrillington came out, when they would have all these little fake announcements in the society pages about, man of independent means, Percy Thrills Thrillington, whatever, the whole thing. Maybe he just gets a kick out of it and it's fun, because for being Paul McCartney is such a, I would imagine, heavy thing, and it's just fun for him to have all these faces and faucets. But who knows? Yeah, I mean, for somebody who seems to be A, extremely image conscious, and B, really want to assert his funkiness and weirdness and almost punkiness, it is interesting. You're right. I agree with you.
Yeah. When you said punkiness, and you also mentioned how much you love Back to the Egg, I think of a song like To You, and there's no other song in his catalog like To You. That keyboard solo, whatever it is. Oh, actually, it was a guitar sent through a harmonizer, I think it was, as Lawrence Juber explained to me. But it's really weird, and it's a sound that Yes copied on Owner of a Lonely Heart,
Oh
as he explained
yeah.
to me. Yeah, but it's a really strange sound on that particular song. But I wish that, if he's so proud of all this experimentation and getting weird, why doesn't he talk about that more in his interviews? In his interviews, it's almost always about the Beatles.
Yeah.
Is it because he thinks that's what the public wants to hear? Or is that because the people who are interviewing him only can ask questions about the Beatles?
Right. I mean, although I did think it was interesting, I love the, whatever you want to call it, authorized biography, pseudo autobiography, the
Many years
many
from now?
years from now.
Yeah.
I love that book, and I thought it was interesting that he had Barry Miles write it as opposed to, Anthony DeCurtis or some music like really prestigious music journalist, as opposed to one of his mid 60s avant-garde art buddies who would kind of, I think by definition, focus more on that stuff, the kind of indica side, when he was living at Wimpole Street. And so maybe, I mean, if you're going to decide, because I mean, Lord knows how many people have approached him to do an authorized biography or help him ghostwrite an autobiography. It
Hmm.
was interesting that that was the guy he chose, who knew him in that period,
Right.
and kind of knew how avant-garde he could be and how weird and out there he could be. So maybe that was his attempt at kind of creating that narrative, or starting that narrative, or setting that narrative, I should say, whatever the term is. Just because that book is so focused on, I mean, the Beatles are almost something that's happening in a lot of
Hmm.
scenes, sort of on the fringe, and a lot of it is him talking about, going around to the Bag of Nails and seeing Georgie Fame and watching Jimi
Right.
Hendrix and all that kind of extracurricular stuff. So that was interesting to me.
Yeah. So would you say, in your opinion, is Paul McCartney to you like the greatest artist of your lifetime, or are there any that you rate higher? Just curious, as a Beatle fan and for this channel, because you have a lot of appreciation for a lot of different artists, a lot of different music. I know you do, but since you mentioned Paul being the most, the one that you find the most fascinating, and there's so many reasons why you've given why you admire him, would you place him at the top, or give me a sense of the other people that you rate real highly?
I I think probably the only person that for me would maybe approach him is someone like Brian Wilson, who I admire kind of for completely different reasons. I somebody who seems to be completely free of any kind of, for good or ill, artifice, um, which I think is been, to his, probably to his detriment in many ways over the years. I think that somebody who was just such an open heart and an open wound,
Hmm.
unfortunately, in a lot of cases. Um, I admire, and in a lot of the same way that people admire John, that music was such an act of therapy for, I think, someone like Brian Wilson. It was a way of, I think it was David Leaf said in the Brian Wilson biography, Andy biography, wrote music to bring joy to other people, sure, but he was really writing music to bring joy and peace to himself. And I think that comes through in so much of his music, and I admire his guts. Well, talking about Paul and being a more harder than, I think, the image that he wants to put out as being sort of the cute, cuddly one, and braver with some of his musical choices. I feel that way about Brian, basically hijacking a multi-million-dollar musical franchise that, oh, by the way, was his family as well,
Hmm.
and just steering it over into making it how he wanted it to be, something that really had no place in the marketplace of uh 65, early 66, really. I mean, if you listen to even, so not even Pet Sounds, but even like something like Beach Boys Today, the second side, which is all ballads like Please Let Me Wonder and She Knows Me Too Well and In the Back of My
Hmm.
Mind. I mean, really, I mean, any of those songs could have gone on Pet Sounds, I think, because they're so ornate in terms of their arrangements and instruments, but just so lyrically sophisticated. And I know lyrics weren't completely his thing, but he obviously had a great say over, when he was working with a lyricist, most of the time it was born out of a conversation that he would instigate. So even if he didn't write all the lyrics himself, so many of them were born out of his own sentiment and kind of, what he was trying to express with his lyrical partner, either Tony Asher for Pet Sounds or
Hmm.
I forget who he was working with on Beach Boys Today. I admire him. I admire him for his vulnerability. I admire him obviously for his talent and his willingness to experiment and take risks, especially when those risks uh, were really not supported by anyone in his organization, including his own family. Um, so I admire them both for a lot of the same ways, Paul and Brian, and I know they admire each other probably for those
Yeah.
same ways as well. Um, yeah, I admire. There's a whole mo that I feel like certain acts of that era on the crossover from showbiz, when the Beatles were doing the Royal Variety Show and the Palladium and
Hmm.
all the Christmas pantomime shows and stuff. That crossover from show business to art, if I can use that word without seeming like being pretentious, about having to kind of, there's that word again, subversive, to try to make the change from within. We are already a top 40 act, and now
Hmm.
we're going to try to bring people along slowly. And those shifts with bands, I think I can't think of anybody who probably did it in a more extreme and successful way than the Beach Boys and the Beatles in the mid 60s, starting as, I was watching those old beach party movies recently, and all of a sudden the Beach Boys cropped up in one, and it was
Hmm.
really jarring because a year and a half later they're doing playing with theremins and stuff, and it was just funny how quick that change was, how they would have one foot in knowing what would make the Suits happy,
Right.
and one foot in working with Van Dyke Parks and these people that are really doing really out there unique innovative approaches to music. And I just find the ability to exist in both of those spheres and excel at it, I think, is really interesting, because I think there's people who can be avant-garde and are so in their own world and in their own lane that people, I'll use myself as an example, can't really accept it or understand it, and it doesn't really connect. And then you have people that are purely cranking out top 40 hits.
Hmm.
And I think that the ability to do both and to expand listeners' consciousness, interest, influence, whatever you want to, sonic palette, whatever you want to call it, I think is really a tremendous talent and tremendous gift for all of us fans. I think that's why I like Brian and Paul the most, I would say, of any other artist. I'm really trying to think. I think it's really those two for me.
That's well said. I know someone once said to me that that the Beatles or someone like Paul reminds that person of Alfred Hitchcock in a way
Whoa.
that, like, the Beatles were innovative and groundbreaking, but at the same time found a way to be accessible.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with Hitchcock's movies. And you could probably say that about, Brian, if you want to. I want to just ask you something about, Pet Sounds, because I love that album so much. I should know the Beach Boys catalog more thoroughly, but I don't. I know all their hits. I love Pet Sounds. But I know Paul has talked about God Only Knows as like the greatest song ever. But I'm waiting for the day. I swear to God, that instrumental part where there's drums and flutes,
Piccolo, yeah.
Paul borrowed that. And that's what he put in Let Him In.
Wow. Yeah. I never thought of that.
Yeah. So when you listen to I'm Waiting for the Day, it's like, well, that's kind of like the middle part of Let Him In there. So I never heard Paul say it, but Paul's talked about how, he found it interesting that the bass parts in Beach Boy songs, that it wasn't always the root of the chord, that Brian would always sometimes use the fifth of a chord. He would notice these things, and that would, you know, create a different feel or a different, like a tension sometimes where you place those bass notes. And he was paying attention to that. So it's really a shame that, and I love the duet they did, A Friend Like You, but I wish that they really seriously sat down and wrote together, considering the fact that they have such great admiration for each other.
Oh yeah, I mean, what, born 2 days in an ocean apart, two bass playing, melodic harmonic geniuses. That would have been amazing. And the best we got was that song and Paul chomping on celery for a vegetables session during Smile. I think, to my knowledge, I think that's all we got.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, let's make a suggestion. Let's write to Paul's
Yeah.
people. Get him to work with Brian, you know? So this has been great, Jordan. I'm going to post the links for two recent articles that you wrote for
Oh,
people.
thank you. Thank
One
you
of
very
which
much.
is it's called Let It Be, Rethinking Let It Be. And it's all about the Get Back Let It Be sessions and your comments about the box set. We should do a whole show on that.
Oh man,
uh,
I we have a lot to say about the box set.
yeah. And you also wrote an article which is based on McCartney's lyrics book that came out about the feud between John and Paul and the too many people versus, how do you sleep and all that. So I'm going to post the links for that so you can get a sample for those of you who aren't familiar with Jordan's work as a writer. And I'll also post some of the links for your podcast too.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I hope you all enjoy.
Yeah, you can get a taste of all the different work that Jordan does, and he knows a lot about so much other music. You can get a feel for that through his work, and just anytime Google his name, Google People magazine, you'll see articles that have been written by Jordan. One recently about Sam Cooke, about a documentary on him. So I'm learning about Jordan's work too. As you guys are. But it has been great having you here.
Oh, it's been a
And,
pleasure. Thank you.
you know, welcome back anytime you want to.
Oh,
You're welcome
thank you,
back
sir.
anytime you want to. And stay in touch. And thanks to everybody for watching. And if you haven't done so, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks so much, everybody. Thank you, Jordan. And we'll see you next time.
That was